Hello there, I'm Unresolved, the Birth Whisperer, and it is my mission to help you move on to a better birth. Now, I have a few Google searches posted so that whenever something pops up about birth trauma, then I get a notification. And a couple of weeks ago, I received a notification about this new book called Heal Your Birth Story. And I was really intrigued, and so I quickly downloaded it onto my iPad, the Kindle version. I didn't want to wait to get the hard copy. And so I got into it, and I was so deeply inspired that I knew I had to interview the author and share her wisdom with you. She's a psychologist called Maureen Campion, and she's created a book that will help countless women find peace with their birth story. I was so deeply touched by her compassionate nature and her sense of humour. And so I'm so excited to be interviewing Maureen Campion today. She's a psychologist and she loves blending her own personal experiences as a mum with her professional training to help people build amazing relationships and strong families. And she's also worked with countless women who've experienced birth trauma and helped them to move on. She lives and works in the Twin Cities in America, and she loves Facebook and Skype too, I guess, for connecting with people all over the world. So introducing Maureen Campion. So Maureen, I'm going to start with a really important question, which is that so many women experience birth trauma, but they really don't realize that they have, and they may never know, and they may never heal. I know that you took a while to realize that you had experienced birth trauma and that it was unresolved. Can you tell us when you realized that you had a problem with a past birth?
Well, it was my first pregnancy and my second pregnancy are 18 years apart. And so I was working with a doula to try to get a vaginal birth after cesarean. And she just kind of said, "So, have you done anything about your birth trauma?" And I had never heard that term. And really, like, as a psychologist, I'm rolling it around in my head going, well, birth, trauma, birth. And then I started to bawl. And I'm like, oh, that would be what unresolved trauma looks like. And so then at that point, that would have been, well, that child is 13 now. There wasn't anything available. We just got to at least have some conversations, and it got to be acknowledged. And since then, you know, I've been kind of watching for it, and I want to talk to everybody about it, and I didn't, but I do kind of like wonder it's hard to even remember like that I had this. I always think of like this closet that I had locked, and there was stuff in there kind of oozing, but I just forgot about it. I forgot that I had locked all of that away until somebody said the right words.
Yeah, so that's really an important point, I think, is that the first thing was just she mentioned something about it. Your doula mentioned something about it, and it was just like, whoa, all these feelings just came out. So maybe you can explain, how would someone know, apart from, you know, a whole lot of feeling, that they were dealing with unresolved birth trauma? What would be some clues?
I think for a lot of women, the thing I hear is that they don't really want to hear other women's stories. They kind of numb out or back away, or their own birth story is kind of like, oh, it's fine. Oh, it's okay. There's just not a lot of depth to the conversation around birth for them. They can't really go there. It's that disconnect between some of the emotional resonance and the story. If you have a kind of fine story, or you don't want to talk, sometimes a lot of women I know have a lot of trouble around birthdays, that their baby's birthday is also really hard for them. So it's hard because it's almost like these little landmines that you bump into and then can feel the rawness or the unresolvedness. And for a lot of people, I even kind of avoid the word trauma because a lot of women will then go like, oh, it wasn't trauma. So I often just talk, and that's why the book is called Birth Stories, because it can be just that there are parts of it that really hurt. It doesn't have to be the worst story. And so many women are so discounting of well, it wasn't trauma, or it wasn't that bad, or it could have been worse. Or I know a lot of women that, you know, have their own issues. And so we discount that part.
What would you say to a woman who feels like, you know, it wasn't so bad, or, you know, my baby was okay, I was sort of okay, and they don't think it was traumatic? How do you approach that?
Well, I think that it's so personal. So I know some women who've had stories that maybe everybody else would have felt were traumatic, and they really are okay with it. But I think it's that piece of that there's that nagging sense that I'm not really okay with it, or I should be okay with it, rather than actually being okay with it. So usually if I just acknowledge that, wow, that might have been hard, or, even if you just kind of really ask, do you want to talk about it? Then that opens up that wound for people, and that's all they really need, is to be able to share it and acknowledge it and let some of that feeling occur.
Many people, they don't even really, it's that uncomfortable feeling that's there when we have any trauma, people just don't even want to touch it. And I think what is so clear in your book is that you explain when you were pregnant and for the second time, you realized that part of preparing for a better birth was actually investigating and examining your past birth. A lot of women might think, look, I'll just move on, it will probably be okay, I'll just hope for the best. Why do you think it is important to examine that stuff?
I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I hadn't had any more children, because I think I would have been a really bad psychologist. If women came into the office and wanted to talk about their birth, I would be cold and disconnected. And I don't know that I would hear them. And then just the women in my life. I mean, I think about how much I would have missed, even not my own births. And then the future for my own children and potential grandchildren and the people in my life that I want to be able to be present. And just the fact that I have this kind of oozing closet of unresolved stuff that I'm ignoring doesn't really sound very good. So I just think that it is very hard, because I don't really remember what I didn't know. I didn't know. The most interesting part for me was the fact that my mom, I was a single mom with my first, and my mom was present, and she had a really great history of natural births, and she was very supportive in my first birth. But afterwards, we never spoke about it. So for 17 years, she felt like she had let me down. I felt like I had let her down. And we just kind of didn't talk about it. And so even in that relationship, I mean, we didn't acknowledge that there was an impact for 17 years, even though I saw her all the time. So I'm so glad that I kind of had to. And also just that sense that I have had so many women who, my mother-in-law, I met a woman at a cocktail party recently whose kids are all 30 years old or older, and she just started and telling some of her stories. And I'm like, they're raw. They're not old memories for people. If you haven't done the work, they're still kind of kicking your butt somehow. And so I do think that usually if we can just kind of nudge people a little bit, they want it to feel different than it does.
Right. Yeah, many people would think maybe it's not even possible. But just before we go into that, what were the benefits for you? And I think you've touched on them. What are the benefits for you of clearing that leftover muck and residue? And what have you seen the benefits as being for the women that you've worked with?
I feel like for so many women, once you've done the work that you do, you now get to be a witness to other people's stories. And so when I ask a woman, so how was the birth? I want to hear the real story, not just the sanitized version, not just the easy version. That I seem to just be this opening that allows people to tell me what really happened. And that most people's births are messy and complicated. There are wonderful, wonderful things that happen. And then there are the parts that weren't your favorite, that were hard, that were scary. And so that full experience of birth has made such a difference for professionally, personally, my next two births. How were your next two births different? I had attempted VBAC with Joey that ended up being a very healing cesarean, because I felt empowered and in control, and I knew what to expect, and it was just different. And through the whole thing, I just kept feeling like, oh, this is. And it was interesting because, of course, I was disappointed. I had gone into it with the intention to have a vaginal birth. But it was more like trying to run a marathon and not running a marathon. Like, that's not a failure. You don't feel like you're like, I almost did it. And I felt so good after that birth. And I felt really resolved. I don't remember feeling at that point that there was anything left that I needed to clear up. It just felt so different.
What did you do to make it an empowering cesarean experience?
Well, I think it really helped that my doula kind of did some meditation with me. She really encouraged me to just talk about it and think about it and I did have some time. The nice thing was that was very early in my pregnancy. And so I did have like 7 months to kind of think about, that was birth trauma. Wow, what would that look like? And to start considering and to have a conversation with my mother and to have a conversation with my husband about what I was afraid of. And then to go into my, to pick a provider that I felt really secure with and to talk to my provider about, what had gone wrong and to get my birth records. There was a lot of things that just were part of the natural planning, but that I got to use as a tool to really feel differently about what had happened and to prepare for what I wanted. I was really well prepared for my first birth, except that, somehow you don't know what you don't know.
Yeah. So, and what was the next step? So your next birth after the positive cesarean?
And then he was kind of the bonus. The last is my, the icing on the cake, because I never thought I would have 3 kids. I was 40 years old, and finding a provider that would let me attempt a vaginal birth when I have had 2 cesareans for failure to progress with 10-pound babies. I'm 40 years old. Like, I had every strike against me. And so we worked very hard to get this shot at it. And it felt like it felt like it was a big challenge for me. Let's see. But it didn't come from a place of needing to resolve something. It was much more, I really believe in vaginal birth after cesarean. I knew it was the best thing for my baby. And I thought I should have a shot at it. I thought I deserved to have a chance to do what my body was meant to do. And that birth, once I went into labor, a little earlier, not as late, with a little bit smaller baby, I just kept running around going, this feels different, this feels different, this feels different. And my doula, and the same doula, same husband, saying, it was supposed to feel different. And I'm like, oh. So I have, even in that one, now I can really see how, even in the best of births, there are moments that were really scary and that didn't feel like what I expected it to feel like, and I wasn't totally in control. So it's interesting that kind of my most peaceful birth was probably my second one, because once I decided that 40 hours of labor was enough, I was having a cesarean. It was very serene and lovely, and the third was crazy and fast and intense and beautiful and wonderful. And so I kind of get to be the poster child of I've tried a little bit of everything, and so yeah. I can say, I've had that experience, I've had that experience, and so it is fun to be able to be like, I have a little bit of everything.
Yeah, right. So, Maureen, if a woman is watching this and she's actually like, wow, realizing I do have some uncomfortable feelings, there's something there, she's maybe pregnant or thinking she'd like to get pregnant, but scared to go there and unsure if it's actually possible to deal with this stuff. She might not have done much, healing work for herself before. Where to start? Can you just name like 2 or 3 practical steps? What next?
I think that the simplest thing for most women is to journal, to just tell themselves the whole story, to start with, because you have so much control over it. It's so important that we not re-traumatize women. Certainly therapy can be helpful, but for a lot of therapists, they don't understand it, and I'm a little afraid that they can do more harm than good if they don't get what they're supposed to be doing. It really is just a story that needs to be told. And so if you give yourself time and you take it slow, and sometimes I think it has to be told 100 times. It has to be told, what would you like to say to your partner? What would you like to say to the provider? What you want to say to your baby? There's so many layers. And as you write, you'll find, and I forgot about that. And there was this other thing that happened. It's not a linear process. It's layers and layers. And so, but you also get to be done. You get to put it on the shelf for a while. You get to put it on the shelf for weeks if you don't want to do it right now. Because so much of what happens in birth, we have no control over. And we can't do it on our schedule. I would like a day off now in the middle of my birth. And so I think that the biggest thing is to be able to have that real sense of control, that I'm going to tell my story in my way, in my time, and to trust that you do know how to heal. and that you'll just walk yourself through to the next step. And then sometimes after that, certainly it can be wonderful to share that with the people that you feel safest with. But I think for ourselves, it's mostly like we just have to give ourselves permission to have our own story.
That's lovely. And one thing that I love in your book is this idea of listening for the best friend's voice. Can you explain what that means?
So I think for the most part, women can be pretty mean to themselves in their head. That we are harsh, we are dismissive. And so what I often ask women to do is to consider, would you say that to your best friend? If your best friend came to you and wanted to talk about their birth, would you say, oh, it was no big deal, and you're making something out of nothing, and oh, get over it? Like, I think most of us are better friends than that. And so one of the nice things is when I started this, the book comes from this workshop that I've been doing for 7 years. What I found was it is very hard to sit in a room and have women share their stories and feel judgmental. Like, we're so compassionate with each other that it's almost contagious. Like, if you're not going to judge any other woman in the room, how can the rules of the universe then be, but you did your birth wrong? And so it's very wonderful to have women kind of just consider that they do know how to be forgiving and compassionate. They just don't usually turn it on themselves. And so I think about just that criticalness of, I could have, if only I would have done this, and if only I would have done that, and if I would have done this, then that, I should have exercised more, I should have read more, I should have prepared differently. Like, we wouldn't do that to anyone else in our life. And so it isn't very nice. And so to just consider that we just need a lot more compassion for ourselves.
That's so true. And one area where women feel or can be particularly hard on themselves is in response to their baby's trauma, their baby's traumatic experience of birth. They can just feel so much guilt. Can you respond to this?
Yeah, I don't. I think that we are some kind of a unit, that what we go through together, and it isn't our fault any more than it's their fault. It is what happened to both of us. And there's a different side of the experience that they have than what our experience is, and some of it's different and some of it's very similar. But I think that it's just disrespectful to the process to act like we did something to our babies. It's not a great way to start our relationship as parents with them, with that level of guilt. And I know that the women who shared their stories with me, they've never done anything that they thought was going to hurt the baby, or that they meant to hurt. Things happened and they were out of control, or it was really complicated. And so to give ourselves permission to know that it isn't that it was nothing, because I do think that birth trauma on some level has an impact on babies. It has an impact on our relationship with our babies. It's not the best way to get started, but it's not our fault. It's something we both went through together. And I think the best thing we can do as mothers is to do our work so that it opens up their healing somehow, because they're just little. They don't really have a story yet.
Yeah, right. So that if we're personally less stuck about it, it's like the I don't know, the energy, the feelings can move more easily. Like, things can shift more easily for them too, maybe.
Yep. Yeah, that's my understanding of how it works in some strange way.
Yeah.
But also just because then we get to tell them their birth story. We get to be more present. It's not helpful to be guilty. It's not helpful to be wrong. It's not helpful to feel like you screwed up. And if we just have this, you wouldn't believe the story of what we went through and how far we've come and how much better we're doing now, then it's an empowering story that we're both a part of, that we share, that I think can really help our relationship as mom.
So if women are feeling guilty about that, then start with your own stuff.
Yeah.
Right. So, Maureen, what would you say to someone who has had one or more traumatic births, possibly surgical or not, and she'd really love to have maybe a VBAC, a more natural birth, and is feeling really doubtful that that's actually possible? What do you say?
It's complicated because there's like a political level that I think that we need to be fighting for women's birth rights in the world, and for women to have the best chance at a good outcome. that doesn't mean that every woman gets to have the birth that she wants. And so, and a lot of women, like, they're only going to have one child or they're done. This isn't the only path out. You don't get to heal this by getting a great birth. That's really risky. It puts an awful lot on a baby and a lot of pressure on yourself. So I just think it's like, it's often the impetus. Like, a lot of women will want to make sure their birth work is done because they're pregnant and they want to have a better birth next time. But I think it's really important to just kind of consider that we need to heal trauma because trauma is hard on us. It's hard on our beings. It's psychologically exhausting. And so I just think that it's kind of important to put those on two different paths, that we should certainly advocate for our best birth outcomes if we're having more children. But I think that we should heal our traumas because it's good for us no matter what we're going to come up against.
Given your experience of being in that place of having had 2 cesareans and being hopeful and yet maybe not too full of expectation, it's such a fine wire to walk, that feeling of like being optimistic and hopeful and yet not wanting to be too attached to that.
My midwife, after my youngest was born, said, well, we weren't really sure you could do it. And I'm like, what? But she never once gave me that impression, which I appreciate. The statistics were against me. I mean, there was a low chance that I was going to be successful, and I was successful. But I think that, because Joey's birth, even though it was a surgical birth, was so healing and empowering, that I think, and I don't think it's even just birth. I mean, I think there are ways that we learn to take experiences and find the empowerment and stand up for ourselves and advocate and fight and have it be transformational. And I don't think that has to just be in birth. So I did feel like, I mean, I knew what I wanted to happen, but I was very prepared that I didn't need it to be, probably more importantly, both of my second and my third births couldn't be traumatic. Like, I just needed to feel like I was in control and that I knew what I was getting into and that I was better emotionally prepared for whatever happened, being that I did my best.
Right.
And so I think that was the part that that meant that the outcome it wasn't so tied to some specific outcome. It's like, I want to do this and do this with my heart intact.
Right. Yeah, I think that's totally what I'm hearing, is that maybe have an aspiration, prepare yourself well, be really well supported, but above all, be kind to yourself, whatever happens. Yeah. So, Maureen, I'm pretty much come to the end of all of these things that I wanted to talk with you about, but just before I go, I wanted to just share something that really made me cry. I wrote this to you. That is in your book, and it says, it's like you're speaking to a woman who's had birth trauma, and you say, someday you will hear a woman share her story and realize that you listened without thinking about your own birth. There will come a day when you tell your big kid the story of their birth, and you do it without tears, without choking up. And that day you will see that you did it. You healed it. You moved it safely into your past. And yeah, just moves me so much, just that healing is possible. So,
yeah, and I think that's the thing. That's what I want, is for women to not have that rawness, that unresolved feeling, that it isn't that I'm going to give anybody amnesia. I can't change the past, but it becomes a story of recovery, a story of healing, a story of what you got through instead of what happened to you. And that's just such a more peaceful place to walk around in.
Maureen, thank you so much for your amazing work. I'm really deeply grateful for this conversation and for what you're doing.
It's so much fun to talk about something that I love so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for watching. If you've been inspired, then share, because your voice supports respectful, positive childbirth for all mothers and babies and everywhere. Please make a comment, send the link to this video onto your friends, post on Facebook, and do sign up for more birth wisdom, helping so many women move on to a better birth. Sign up for my emails at thebirthwhisperer.com.